During the last decade, and especially in current modern games, the lore behind the Kirby series seems to attract more attention while enlarging a bigger interest at the same time. As someone who obviously focuses on Kirby, I definitely got the impression viewers are interested in what is going on behind the scenes, and Star Allies in particular build up a narrative that still lets people theorize about all sorts of stuff. Newcomers, however, may be confused by what I mean when talking about a greater story, since each Kirby game is rather straightforward and only features dialogue or serious moments during the climax, if at all. What I mean is not the story, but the lore. Every information that adds to the universe around the games and gives characters more depth in their motivations. A perfect example would be Highness rant in Kirby Star Allies, where he and the text box go insane. Casual players may have apprehended this short moment as a means to underline his madness, but if you actually take the time and carefully read every sentence, it's clear there must have been more to his character than simply being a lunatic. Unfortunately for him, there is no meaning behind his massive nose. Another prime example is the pause screen description of bosses, or more recently, the specifications when you collect figures in Kirby and the Forgotten Land. The story is the narrative that is directly told in a game and resolved at the end, whereas the lore is everything in the background that does not need to be elaborated to understand what is happening. It's more like tasty appetizers for fans who want to know more without hindering the main adventure with unnecessary cutscenes or dialogues. The developers always find a fitting way to expand the narrative without forcing in their interest in stories, and keep these fascinating information in the background. It may sound a little over-exaggerated, but the more the Kirby franchise continues, the more it appears like the lore is one of the most worked out narratives from all Nintendo IPs, which still sounds ridiculous considering series like Zelda or Metroid. Both of these franchises saw moments of either narratively inconsistent situations or a hyper-focus on story, leading the gameplay behind. Kirby, on the other hand, seems to always know how to tell a satisfying bigger picture, and the reason for that is simple, straightforward and quite clever, just like the franchise itself. First of all, I want to emphasize again that I'm not trying to say Kirby games tell better storylines than Zelda or Metroid. Obviously, these titans have a much greater impact on their respective line of actions and definitely leave much stronger impressions when it comes to essential narratively driven moment. I think we can all agree that Zelda falling into Link's arms in tears or Samus simply waving goodbye after rescuing a whole planet probably leaves a more substantial impact on the player's journey than 90% of Kirby games. The difference, however, is how these series approach stories in general, as you have most likely no idea what is going on behind many Kirby adventures in the first place. Take Meta Knight's role in Kirby and the Forgotten Land, for example. Playing the game casually reveals nothing about his actions, as he is only an optional boss in an optional mode, but after taking a look into the descriptions of some trophies, not only do we learn about everything he has done, but also maybe change the way we see the bigger picture. Suddenly, it makes sense to see Meta Knight staying on top of the Colosseum, because this is the role he decided to take, and it no longer feels like the developers put him in this game just for the sake of it. Of course, it would have been nice to see his perspective on the events or get some additional cutscenes, but this would occupy important resources used for the main adventure. And besides, having the knowledge of Meta Knight doing his own stuff while we explore the Forgotten Land makes everything more alive, believable, and overall immersive. However, the main reason why this works so well, not only for this game but every other Kirby title as well, is the optionality. The aforementioned Metroid series is handling things basically in a very similar way, especially the Prime trilogy, where you can get additional information based on your desire to explore your knowledge of the universe. To say Kirby games are similar to Metroid would be a little exaggerated, so in trying to be in line with Kirby's fundamental principle, simplicity, pause screens fulfill that role just perfectly fine. Introduced in Kirby Superstar Ultra, the more the franchise continued, the more elaborated these descriptions became, to a point where even simple bosses get their own elaborated background. It's not about giving intriguing facts anymore, but build up an actual connected world, which could have been a case of misguided focus if it wasn't for the easy optionality behind these descriptions. It doesn't matter how absorbing the lore may be, above all, Kirby is still a gameplay-centered franchise franchise, with the mission to guide beginners into video games thanks to the accessible difficulty. On top of that, even girls or fully grown women can enjoy every Kirby game even if they have never played something in their life, so forcing endless cutscenes and story snippets only fans care about onto the actual target group would be detrimental to the series. This is why the pause screen law is ideal. They are optional while being informative. Casual players will not even notice a greater picture due to how Kirby games lay out their plot. What I mean by that is Kirby Triple Deluxe, for instance. Going through the game regularly, you're simply rescuing King Dedede, fight off the antagonist, and experience a nice quality 2D platformer. Naturally, things like the amazing mirror on the postgame may raise a few eyebrows at most, but it's nothing to make anyone think they are missing out on something. Fans, on the other hand, truly understand the dynamic between the antagonistic force to a point where following entries are referring to this dynamic in a very brilliant yet subtle way. Furthermore, referencing all the titles with lore instead of gameplay or actual scenes gives the developers an easy way to acknowledge the history of the franchise without forcing in Easter eggs only admirers will understand. Star Allies, for example, is a very obvious celebration of everything achieved so far to an extent that all players will understand how to perceive the game, even if one is not familiar with all the characters. Still, there's a downside, and whenever the lore decides to become too ambitious and leave the territory of games, it gets hard to catch up. Back in the Miiverse days, the developers liked to expand on certain aspects with Miiverse posts, which at that time seemed rather logical but myopic in hindsight. Obviously, Nintendo hoped to see a bright future for the Miiverse, but as we all know, this social media platform is no more, and with that, all the interesting information are gone as well. Naturally, it's not like they are completely lost, yet it feels like it was a reminder to never expand on anything if there's a slight chance the core group, the players, have no chance of seeing it. Another thing I want to touch on are the climactic finals of Kirby games. In most cases, the story, so the directly presented narrative, gets resolved in the last minutes during each game and escalates quite quickly in consideration of what kind of franchise this is. Some fans may say this is a trend which started in the recent decade, but truth being told, the very second Kirby game, Kirby's Adventure, already implemented such a turn. Instead of only fighting King Dedede, there's an actual plot twist with a secret demonic-looking final boss. For a NES game, this kind of elaborated final is by no means the standard and introduced the basic formula of how a Kirby final should play out. In a sense, it's a story on its own, with the introduction of the events, middle part and revelation of what is going on, and finally climax to save the world. In its core, this is the reason why Kirby finals feel so monumental in the first case, because they follow a narratively exciting formula which, coincidentally or not, often clashes with the cutesy tone of the franchise itself. It's not without reason that players eagerly joke in every new title which kind of hellish entity will be the final boss this time. Normally you could argue this does not stand in comparison to the overall atmosphere of the franchise, but the reason why confrontation of cute versus creepy works so great, not only in Kirby, but entertainment media as a whole, is the vile villain Zacharin show trope. You probably often came across certain scenes in children's media where the mere concept of what is going on feels actually rather dark if you think about it. This may be because something utterly horrible is suddenly going on or the circumstances turned into another direction. But the vile villain Zacharin show concept focuses on the arrival of an antagonistic force which, up to its point of arrival, is unmatched in terms of villainous tonal shift. Here's an easy example most Kirby fans are familiar with. Kirby's Dream Land 3 features a dark force slowly taking over the world, and it's up to Kirby to travel through the planet and cleanse every corner of Popstar. Before reaching the final, every boss is either simple in design, animalistic, or rather cute looking, which ultimately fits the franchise. The secret final boss, however, may follow the simplistic design choice, but appears to be extremely scary thanks to the color combination, and after ripping out a bloody eyeball, it becomes more than apparent that something clearly went into another direction. If you want to be specific, modern entries feature final bosses who follow a similar blueprint but show some redeeming qualities qualities, which would put them in more specific tropes like the Knight of Cerberus or complete monster, but I suppose you understand the concept. It's without a doubt not done randomly and was always a clear choice, which shows its effect the best in the Kirby franchise. You could argue that villains like King K. Rool or Dimension are similar, but they still act within the tone of the franchise and do not really clash with anything. Even in the case of Kirby, young children just do not really question the greater theming behind these horrendous enemies, because everything up to this point trained them to see the series in a certain light, which ultimately explains why this trope is even working in the first place. And this also goes for the general lore as such. As long as it stays optional and does not interfere with the gameplay, I think we are going to see many interesting untold stories we have to find out about.